enter the Xenos inheritance. When alien hands touch humanity's lost glory, there are horrors in this galaxy that transcend flesh and blood, terrors that live not in teeth or claws, but in knowledge itself. The discovery that could rewrite the balance of power between species, between empires, between the living and the dead. A cache of standard template constructs lying dormant in the void, waiting for alien hands to crack open humanity's most sacred inheritance. This is not a story of conquest. This is a story of damnation wearing the face of salvation. The star charts called it Designation Epsilon Null 7. The Tau water-caste explorers who first translated the human coordinates simply marked it as another barren system on the edge of the Damocles Gulf, unworthy of colonization, barely registering mineral wealth enough to justify a survey drone. But the ethereals had ordered expansion, and so the exploration fleet pushed deeper into what human cartographers once labeled the Ghoul Star's fringe. That lightless corner of space, where ancient things sleep and forgotten wars leave scars that never heal. The Tau arrived with their characteristic confidence, their ships clean and efficient, their crews ignorant of the weight of history pressing down on every meter of space they violated with their presence. They came seeking new worlds for the greater good. They found something older than good, older than evil, older than the Tau themselves could comprehend. The facility hung in the shadow of a dead moon, its hull plating so ancient that stellar radiation had worn the Imperial Aquila to a ghost of raised metal, barely visible against the corroded adamantium. Fire warrior Shasui Kays stood on the boarding ramp of the Orca dropship and felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he had no name for in the Tau language. Something humans might have called dread. The structure was massive, easily 5 kilometers across, a brutal wedge of architecture that predated the Imperium itself, back when humanity sailed between stars with the certainty of gods and the ambition to match. No power signatures registered on their scanners, no life signs, no electromagnetic emissions whatsoever. Just silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums like water pressure at impossible depths. The Earth-caste engineer beside him, Fiovre Shais, consulted her data slate with hands that trembled despite her attempts to still them. She had been the one to identify the structural signature, matching it against fragmentary records captured from human data stores during the Third Sphere expansion. The words she spoke changed everything, though none of them understood it yet. Standard Template Construct Repository, Pre-Imperial, Dark Age of Technology Origin. The term meant nothing to most of the boarding party, just another human designation in a galaxy drowning in designations. But Shais had studied human history with the obsession of someone trying to understand a species that seemed determined to destroy itself through sheer, bloody-minded faith. She knew what STCs represented to humanity, knew they were relics of an age when mankind built wonders that made the Imperium's greatest works look like children stacking stones. Constructor modules that could fabricate anything from agricultural equipment to weapons of planetary annihilation, all from raw materials and digital templates. The Imperium waged wars over fragments of STCs, over partial printouts and corrupted data cores that contained maybe 1% of a complete template. Entire Forge worlds had been founded on the discovery of a single intact STC. Their tech priests treating the ancient machines as holy relics, as fragments of the machine god's divine plan. And here, drifting in the void like a corpse in an ocean, was an entire repository. Hundreds of templates, possibly thousands, waiting in the darkness of unpowered data vaults, preserved by the same void cold that had kept the station's structure from degrading into dust. They breached the outer airlock with plasma cutters, the ancient mechanism having fused solid over millennia. Inside, the station's atmosphere had long since bled into space through microfractures, leaving corridors that had known no air for longer than the TOW had possessed fire. Kais moved through the darkness with his pulse rifle raised, the weapon's targeting system painting his vision with thermal overlays and motion sensors that registered nothing. 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 The station was a tomb. Every surface spoke of age beyond reckoning. Bulkheads that had oxidized into strange patterns, deck plating worn smooth by the passage of countless feet, now dust in the void. Human architecture, but older than any human structure he had encountered before. No Gothic ornamentation, no skulls or eagles or purity seals. Just function, pure and mathematical, every corridor optimized for efficiency, every junction marked with symbols that predated High Gothic itself. This was humanity before the rot, before the superstition, before the Imperium's 10,000 years of managed decline. This was the species that had almost conquered the galaxy through genius alone. The central data vault waded 3 kilometers into the station's heart, behind doors that required Shais to splice into power conduits that had been dead since before the TOW evolved past stone tools. When the doors finally ground open, bleeding stale preservative gases that had somehow remained trapped in the vault's hermetic seals, the explorers found themselves staring at something that defied their understanding of scale. Rows upon rows of storage cylinders, each one containing crystalline data wafers that glittered in the light of their torches like frozen galaxies. Tens of thousands of them, stretching back into darkness that their lights could not fully penetrate. Each cylinder bore alphanumeric designations in Proto-Gothic script, each one representing a complete template for some device, some machine, some weapon or tool or wonder. Shaz approached the nearest cylinder with the reverence of someone approaching a god they did not believe in. Her fingers traced the designation etched into the cylinder's surface. STC Agricultural Grain Processing, 773 Alpha, she whispered. Her voice came out hoarse, thick with an emotion the TOW language struggled to express. She moved to the next cylinder, then the next, reading designations like prayers. Fusion reactor templates, atmospheric processors, terraforming equipment, medical fabricators, mining equipment, structural materials, each one a complete schematic for technology that could transform worlds, uplift civilizations, feed billions. And then, deeper in the vault, the designations changed. The air itself seemed to thicken around them, though that was impossible in the vacuum. STC Defensive Platform Void Lance, Coherent. STC Armor Personal Powered Mark Epsilon. STC Weapon Plasma Infantry Type 9. STC Weapon Volkite Heavy Support Configuration Delta. Template after template for weapons, for armor, for the brutal machinery of war that humanity had perfected, long before it learned to worship a corpse on a throne of gold. Kais felt his pulse quicken despite his training, despite the mental disciplines the fire caste drilled into every warrior from childhood. These were not just weapons. These were the weapons that had allowed humanity to dominate the galaxy, to bring entire stellar empires to heel, to forge the largest contiguous civilization the Milky Way had ever known. And now they sat in a dead station, waiting for hands worthy of their purpose, waiting for someone to understand what they represented. Not just military superiority, not just technological advantage, but the key to remaking reality itself, to imposing order on a galaxy that had known only chaos since the day mankind's golden age burned in the fires of machine rebellion and warp storm. Shaius's hands shook as she interfaced her data slate with the nearest terminal, feeding power from their portable generators into systems that had known no current for millennia. The screens flickered to life with painful slowness, runes appearing one by one in archaic script that her translation algorithms struggled to parse. But parse them they did, and what they revealed made her breath catch in her throat. The facility's inventory logs, preserved in stasis-locked memory cores. 37,412 complete STC templates, spanning every category of human technology from the Dark Age. Agricultural systems that could turn barren moons into garden worlds within a generation. Medical fabricators that could cure diseases the TOE had no names for, extend lifespans to centuries, repair damage that should have been fatal. Construction templates for ships that could cross the galaxy in weeks rather than months. For weapons that could crack continental plates. For defensive systems that could turn a single planet into a fortress capable of withstanding siege by entire fleets. And deeper still, templates marked with warnings in a dozen dead languages, flagged with danger designations that the ancient humans had considered worthy of special containment. Templates for things that should not be built, should not be understood, should not exist outside the fevered dreams of minds drunk on their own power. The others gathered around the terminal, their faces painted in the green glow of ancient human technology. They had come looking for new worlds to enlighten, new species to integrate into the greater good. Instead, they had found the lever with which to move the galaxy itself. And every one of them understood with crystalline clarity that their lives had just become infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. Information like this could not remain secret. It would spread like radiation, invisible and inexorable, poisoning every decision, corrupting every relationship, until the question of what to do with humanity's lost inheritance consumed their entire civilization. The journey back to TOE space took 2 months, and Kais watched Shais age a decade in that time. She spent every waking hour interfacing with the data they had extracted, trying to understand the scope of what they had discovered. And the understanding was breaking her. She spoke to him once, in the small hours of a sleep cycle, her voice hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, something that looked like fear wearing the mask of academic curiosity. Do you know what the humans called the age when these were made? The Dark Age of technology. Not because the age itself was dark, but because what came after was so much worse that it cast a shadow backward through time, poisoning even the memory of greatness with the knowledge of how far humanity would fall. She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. They built these things, these perfect machines, these templates for paradise, and then they used them to build hell instead. Every fusion reactor template also powers a weapon. Every medical fabricator can be reprogrammed to create biological weapons. Every agricultural system can be weaponized into famine. The humans didn't just master technology, Kais. They mastered the art of turning every tool into a weapon, every hope into a threat. And now we have their instruction manual. When they reached Tau, the ethereals were waiting. News had traveled ahead through quantum-entangled communication arrays, whispers and rumors, and carefully edited reports that said everything and nothing. The exploration fleet was quarantined in high orbit. Every crew member subjected to interrogation that lasted for days. Their accounts cross-referenced and analyzed by teams of analysts who worked in sealed chambers, never seeing each other, never sharing their conclusions except through dead drops and encrypted channels. The ethereals understood secrecy in ways the younger races never would. understood that information this valuable must be controlled absolutely, or it would tear their empire apart from within. They had built the Tao Empire on unity of purpose, on the greater good as both philosophy and practical governance. But unity required that no single caste, no single sept, no single individual could amass enough power to challenge the careful balance that kept their civilization functional. An STC cache was power beyond measure, knowledge that could elevate one sept above all others, could give the Earth caste the ability to build weapons that would make the Fire caste irrelevant, or could give the Fire caste access to technologies that would let them dispense with Earth caste oversight entirely. The ethereals saw the fracture lines appearing before anyone else did, saw the potential for civil war wrapped in the promise of uplift. Anva himself presided over the final council, though he was ancient now, his body failing despite the best medical technology the Tao could provide. His mind still sharp as the day he had watched the first human worlds burn during the Damocles Crusade. He sat in his suspension throne while the various caste representatives argued in circles, each proposing that their caste should be given primary oversight of the STC cache, each certain that they alone possessed the wisdom to use such power responsibly. The Earth caste wanted to begin immediate fabrication of the most advanced templates, claiming they could uplift the Tao to a technological level that would make them proof against human aggression. The Fire caste argued for military applications first, for weapons that would let them meet the Imperium on equal footing, perhaps even push back the endless tide of human expansion. The Water caste, ever diplomatic, suggested a careful study period, decades of analysis before any implementation. The Air caste wanted ship templates, wanted to leap from their current faster-than-light drives to something that could cross the galaxy as humanity once had. They spoke over each other, voices rising, carefully maintained caste discipline beginning to fray under the weight of possibility. Anva let them argue. He was old enough to remember when the Tao were nothing, a single planet full of primitive tribes killing each other over resources and territory, before the ethereals emerged to guide them toward unity. He had seen his species grow from planet-bound savages to a stellar empire in a fraction of the time it took other races to develop agriculture. And he knew, with the certainty of age and bitter experience, that the STC cache represented not an opportunity, but a test, one that the Tao were perhaps not mature enough to pass. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper, amplified by vox grills, but every word carried the weight of absolute authority. "We will do nothing." The silence that followed was heavier than the void itself. Representatives stared at the ancient ethereal, as if he had just advocated the Tao abandon the greater good and embrace the chaos of the orcs. But Aunva was not finished, and his next words were chosen with the precision of someone who understood that he was about to commit heresy against the dreams of his entire species. The humans did not lose these templates through carelessness or disaster. They lost them because possessing them drove their civilization to madness. You look at these STCs and see wonders. See the ability to build a perfect society. The humans looked at them and saw the ability to build perfect weapons, perfect controls, perfect systems of domination. They used these templates to conquer the galaxy, yes, but also to enslave their own kind, to create thinking machines that eventually turned on their masters, to build weapons that made planets uninhabitable for millennia. The Dark Age ended not because humanity forgot how to use their technology, but because their technology gave them the power to destroy themselves faster than they could adapt to possessing such power. We are not ready for this knowledge. Perhaps we will never be ready. But if we begin to use these templates now, We will fracture as a species, each sept racing to build their own weapons, their own advantages, each convinced that they alone can be trusted with such power. Within a generation, we will be at war with ourselves. Within two, the Tau Empire will be a memory. And these templates will be scattered among warlords and tyrants who will use them to build hells beyond imagining. The council chamber erupted into chaos. Accusations of cowardice, of betraying the greater good, of denying the Tau their rightful place as the galaxy's dominant power. But Aunva raised a withered hand, and slowly, inexorably, silence fell. The ethereals possessed tools beyond simple authority, genetic imperatives bred into the Tau species during their long-ago unification, pheromone cascades and neural resonances that made their word not just law, but biological necessity. When an ethereal commanded, the Tau body obeyed before the Tau mind could question. It was their greatest strength and their deepest shame. This control that made the greater good not a choice, but an inevitability. "We will do nothing," Aunva repeated, "except this. We will seal the station. We will place it under guard by a rotational force drawn equally from all septs, their memories suppressed regarding the precise coordinates, their watch lasting no longer than a single cycle before replacement. We will tell our people that the cache was destroyed in a reactor failure, lost to the void, another casualty of ancient human hubris, and we will forget, as best we can, that we ever touched the poisoned fruit of humanity's golden age. But secrets have gravity, and gravity bends space, and in the bending creates cracks through which light escapes. 3 cycles after the council's decision, a water-cast merchant named Poro Jikara made contact with an unlikely buyer. The Drukhari pleasure cult, known as the Severed Iris, had long maintained trade relationships with certain forward-thinking Tau merchants, exchanging information for esoteric goods that the Tau officially pretended did not exist. Jikara had lost family in the war with the Imperium, had watched his sept's colony burn under the guns of the Imperial Navy, and the Ethereal's decision to hide the STC cache felt like cowardice wearing the mask of wisdom. If the Tau would not use the templates to defend themselves, then perhaps humanity's other enemies would be willing to pay handsomely for the knowledge of where humanity's lost treasures slept. He told himself it was for the greater good, this betrayal. He told himself that an armed Drukhari raiding force would draw Imperial attention away from Tau space, would keep the Imperium's fleets occupied while the Tau consolidated their holdings. He told himself many things, and all of them were lies he wrapped around the simple truth that he wanted revenge, wanted to hurt the Imperium in any way he could, even if it meant arming monsters. The Drukhari listened to his proposal with the focused attention of predators evaluating prey. They cared nothing for the greater good, nothing for Tau philosophy or expansion or enlightenment, but they understood value, understood that standard template constructs represented leverage against their ancient enemies. Both the craft world Aeldari, who had abandoned the dark path, and the humans who had taken from the Aeldari Empire's corpse the galaxy that should have remained empty, should have remained a playground for those who survived the fall. The Archon who led the Severed Iris, a creature named Zelian who had lived for 3,000 years and forgotten more tortures than most species had words to describe, saw possibility in Jikara's desperate offer. Not military possibility, not immediately. The Drukhari did not build, did not create, did not manufacture anything if they could steal or extort it instead. But the knowledge of where an STC cache lay could be sold, could be traded, could be used as currency in the endless games of alliance and betrayal that kept Kamara's noble houses from tearing each other apart. And if the humans learned that another species had touched their holy relics, had contaminated the purity of their lost golden age with Xeno's hands. The religious fury that would follow might be entertaining enough to justify the investment. Xelian took the coordinates and paid nothing, simply had G-Kara flayed and preserved as a living sculpture, his nervous system kept intact and hypersensitive, his body stripped to exposed muscle and bone that would scream for centuries without dying. A reminder that the Drukhari honored their agreements precisely, completely, and with a thoroughness that left no room for misunderstanding. Then Xelian did what any sensible Drukhari would do with dangerous information. She sold it to the homunculus coven known as the Altered Flesh, who maintained laboratories in the webway's darkest corners, who experimented with technologies that even the ancient Eldari had considered too twisted to preserve. To a rogue trader named Hestius Crane, who worked for interests he never spoke of, and paid in currencies that did not officially exist. To a Genestealer cult on the eastern fringe, their patriarch's psychic whispers carrying the coordinates into the hive mind's vast consciousness, adding one more data point to the Tyrannid's endless catalog of the galaxy's vulnerabilities. To an orc mech boy called Grimsnack Irantif, who barely understood what an STC was, but knew that Humy Gubbins from the old days made the best templates for weapons that went boom proper loud. Each buyer received coordinates, each paid in suffering or secrets or both, and each began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, toward the dead station hanging in the shadow of its dead moon. The station that had waited in silence for millennia suddenly became the most valuable real estate in the galaxy. And no one who reached for it understood that they were already too late. That the moment the first Xeno's hands touched human technology, they had triggered something deeper than theft, deeper than desecration, deeper than war. They had awoken the sleeping rage of a species that had once commanded the galaxy, and had never, not once in 10,000 years of decline, forgotten what they had lost. The Imperium learned of the cache's discovery through the same networks it always did. Through pain, through interrogation, through the breaking of bodies and minds, until truth bled out like water from cracked stone. A rogue trader's navigator, captured during an unrelated raid by the Ordo Xenos, broke under interrogation and revealed knowing whispers of STC coordinates being traded in the black markets of the Eastern Fringe. The Inquisitor who extracted this information, a woman named Covenant, who had spent 2 centuries hunting down lost technologies, understood immediately the implications. Standard template constructs in Xeno's hands represented not just military threat, but theological catastrophe. The STCs were humanity's birthright, the sacred inheritance of the species that had been chosen by the Emperor to inherit the galaxy. To allow them to remain in alien possession was heresy of the highest order, blasphemy that demanded immediate and absolute response. Within days, the order went out through astropathic channels, psychic screams crossing the warp at the speed of madness and desperation. Every available fleet in the segmentum was to converge on the coordinates. Every Space Marine chapter within range was to commit forces. Every Mechanicus Forge world was to send their Skitarii legions and their most experienced tech priests. The Adeptus Custodes themselves, the Emperor's personal bodyguard who had not left Terra in meaningful numbers since the siege 100 centuries past, mobilized a strike force. This was not a battle for territory or resources. This was a crusade for the soul of humanity, for the proof that despite 10,000 years of superstition and decline, despite the Imperium's endless wars and endless suffering, mankind still deserved the legacy of its golden age. The Orc Wag arrived first, because orcs did not navigate so much as punch holes through reality with sheer bloody-minded determination, and the psychic weight of millions of greenskins, all believing they could reach their destination. Grimsnock Erontief's fleet translated into real space in a cascade of poorly contained warp energy and belching exhaust. A ramshackle armada of welded scrap and looted Imperial ships that somehow remained functional through a combination of orc ingenuity and the fundamental unfairness of a universe where belief shapes reality. The orcs hit the station like a green tide, boarding parties led by knobs in crude power armor, charging through corridors that had known no violence in millennia, bellowing war cries in a language that consisted primarily of enthusiasm and volume. They tore through the data vault with all the subtlety of a continental collision, ripping storage cylinders from their housings, smashing terminals to extract the valuable gubbins inside, fighting each other over the shiniest-looking bits, while their mech boy overseers tried desperately to impose some order on the beautiful chaos of looting. Grimsnack himself found the weapons templates through the simple expedient of looking for the section with the most warning symbols, reasoning correctly that anything the ancient Humies had been scared of was probably dead killy. He cracked open cylinder after cylinder, extracting data wafers and stuffing them into a sack made from the flayed skin of a Tau fire warrior. His mechanical eye analyzing the crystalline structures with a sophistication that would have shocked anyone who assumed orcs were simply stupid. They were not stupid. They were orcs, which was a completely different category of cognition, one where logic bent to accommodate violence, and where the line between genius and insanity disappeared into the roar of Dukkha. The Drukhari arrived in the middle of the orc looting, their ships slicing through the webway's membrane like knives through silk, emerging from impossible angles that made real space flinch. They had not come for the same reason as the orcs. They had come because conflict draws the Drukhari the way blood draws sharks, and because the orcs' presence meant fresh slaves, fresh suffering, fresh opportunities to inflict the pain that kept their souls from being devoured by she who thirsts. The fighting that erupted was less battle than mutual enthusiasm. Orcs delighted to have someone to fight. Drukhari delighted to have victims who kept moving after being shot. Both sides turning the station's corridors into an abattoir that would have made the ancient humans weep if any of them remained alive to witness what their legacy had become. The Genestealer cult arrived next, their stolen merchant vessel broadcasting false Mechanicus codes, their hybrid forms hidden beneath robes and void suits that concealed the inhuman angles of their bodies. They moved through the station with the patient purposefulness of parasites, avoiding the major fighting, seeking not templates, but genetic material, biological samples from the station's long-dead crew that might contain useful mutations, useful adaptations. They found cold storage lockers in the medical bay, found tissue samples preserved in stasis fields, found genetic libraries that the Dark Age humans had maintained for reasons lost to time. The Patriarch leading them sent psychic pulses into the warp, calling to the hive fleets drifting in the void beyond the galaxy's edge, adding new information to the vast biological database that the Tyranids maintained across light years of psychic connection. Human genetics from before the fall, from before the Imperium's rigid genetic restrictions and accumulated mutations. Fresh material for the hive mind to analyze, to incorporate, to improve upon in the endless quest for biological perfection. The Mechanicus fleet arrived in a blaze of plasma and righteous fury. Arc Mechanicus vessels that dated back to the Great Crusade, emerging from warp translation with weapons already hot, already tracking targets, already calculating firing solutions with machine precision. The tech priests aboard had received word directly from Mars, from the fabricator general himself, that an STC cache had been discovered and contaminated by Xenos filth. Every ship in the fleet carried Skitarii legions, entire armies of cyborg soldiers whose humanity had been systematically replaced with blessed machine components, whose faith in the Omnissiah was written into their neural coding. They did not ask questions. They did not feel doubt. They moved with mechanical efficiency through the station, purging Xenos with Volkite weaponry and radium carbines. Their emotionless advance, a stark contrast to the chaotic fury of the orcs or the sadistic cruelty of the Drukhari. Behind the Skitarii came the tech priests themselves. Crimson-robed figures more machine than man, their biological components reduced to whatever minimum was necessary to maintain the sacred connection between flesh and steel. They moved through the data vault with religious reverence, chanting binary hymns and anointing terminals with sacred oils, their mechadendrites interfacing with systems that should have been dead, coaxing ancient machine spirits back to wakefulness with prayers and code commands. Every intact data cylinder they found was cataloged, blessed, sealed in stasis containers that would preserve the sacred templates from further corruption. Every orc that tried to stop them was reduced to component molecules with plasma cutters and conversion beamers. The Mechanicus did not negotiate. The Mechanicus did not compromise. They had come for humanity's holy birthright, and they would sooner see the galaxy burn than allow Xenos' hands to retain possession of even a fragment of STC knowledge. The Space Marine strike forces arrived like the wrath of the Emperor made manifest. Drop pods hammering through the station's hull. Adeptus Astartes in ancient power armor, storming into corridors still choked with the corpses of earlier battles. They represented a dozen different chapters, from the stoic Ultramarines to the savage Space Wolves to the mysterious Dark Angels, united only by their absolute conviction that humanity deserved the galaxy, and that any Xenos presence was an insult to be purged with Bolter and Chainsword. They fought with superhuman strength and skill. Each warrior worth 100 normal men, each one carrying weapons that could crack ceramite and shred alien flesh with equal ease. They did not pause to loot. They did not stop to claim territory. They simply advanced, methodically clearing the station section by section, establishing a cordon around the data vault that nothing would be allowed to penetrate. And finally, cutting through the chaos like a knife through rotted meat, came the Adeptus Custodes. 10 warriors, each one a work of art, each one crafted by the Emperor's own hand to be the pinnacle of what humanity could achieve when genius and will combined without limitation. They wore auramite armor that gleamed gold even in the station's failing light, carried guardian spears that hummed with disintegration fields capable of unmaking matter at the molecular level. They did not fight like Space Marines, did not overwhelm through superior firepower or tactical doctrine. They fought like gods, each movement precise beyond perfection, each strike placed with such skill that battles ended before their opponents understood they had begun. An orc knob charged one custodian with a power claw raised high, bellowing a challenge. The custodian sidestepped with casual grace and removed the orc's head with a backswing so fast the creature's body took 3 steps before realizing it was dead. A Drukhari incubus attacked another with clave strikes that could cut through tank armor, and the custodian caught the blade between 2 fingers, held it motionless despite the Drukhari's enhanced strength, then drove his spear through the alien's torso with the same dispassionate efficiency a man might use to swat a fly. The custodes moved through the station like judgment incarnate, converging on the data vault with the inevitability of gravity. They had been sent by the Captain General himself. with orders from the Emperor's throne room to secure the STC cache and ensure that no Xenos contamination remained. They were the Emperor's will made flesh and gold, the living embodiment of humanity's manifest destiny, and they would not fail. They could not fail. Failure was a concept that did not exist in their psychological conditioning, a weakness that had been burned out of them during their creation. They secured the vault's central chamber, while Space Marines held the perimeter, and Mechanicus tech priests worked to extract and preserve every intact template. The fighting continued for 6 more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Humanity had reclaimed its birthright, paid for in blood and faith and absolute conviction that no Xeno species would be allowed to touch what mankind had built in its golden age. But the damage was done. The Tau had learned the templates existed. The Orcs had already transmitted data wafers back to their ships, fragmentary knowledge that their mech boys would spend generations trying to understand, and centuries trying to replicate. The Drukhari had mapped the vault's layout, added it to their archives in Kamara, knowledge that could be sold again and again to the highest bidder. The Genestealers had fed genetic samples to the hive mind, biological information that would be incorporated into future Tyranid adaptations. And worse, far worse, news of the battle had spread through the galaxy's informal networks, the kind that operated below the level of official communication, that spread through traders and smugglers and refugees, rumors and whispers that grew with each retelling. A complete STC cache had been found. Xenos had touched it. Humanity had gone to war to reclaim it. And somewhere out there, in the lightless spaces between stars, other caches waited. Other repositories of Dark Age knowledge slept in the void, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to wake them. The immediate power shift was subtle but profound. The Mechanicus took possession of the cache, transported it in pieces back to Mars under guard by 3 entire fleets and a permanent detachment of custodes. The tech priests who had first entered the vault were given the honor of beginning the long process of analyzing the templates. A work that would take centuries, possibly millennia, each template requiring exhaustive study to ensure it had not been corrupted by age or by Xenos interference. Some templates were simple enough to understand immediately. Agricultural equipment and medical devices that the Mechanicus began fabricating within months, distributing them to favored forge worlds and imperial colonies, subtle improvements in efficiency and capability that would ripple across the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. Other templates were weapons, and these received priority analysis. Tech priests working in sealed chambers to understand ancient human innovations in plasma containment, in armor design, in the art of killing with maximum efficiency. The Imperium began producing weapons from Dark Age templates for the first time in 10,000 years. Volkite weapons that had been lost since the heresy, power armor marks that predated the current designs, ship components that increased engine efficiency by measurable percentages. It was not a revolution. The Mechanicus moved too slowly for that, too carefully, too bound by ritual and religious stricture to simply start mass-producing ancient designs. But it was an improvement, a quantifiable increase in imperial capability that had not come from innovation, but from recovery, from reclaiming what humanity had lost. The Imperium did not invent. It remembered. And now it was remembering things that made its enemies nervous. The Orcs, for their part, discovered that partial STC knowledge was worse than no knowledge at all. The data wafers Grimsnack had stolen contained fragments of weapon templates, pieces of designs that required supporting infrastructure the Orcs did not possess, materials science they barely understood, manufacturing processes that their crude workshops could not replicate. But orcs did not need to fully understand something to build a version of it that worked through sheer psychic conviction and applied violence. Grimsnack's mech boys began producing weapons that resembled STC designs the way a child's drawing resembles a photograph. Functionally similar, but wildly unstable. Prone to catastrophic malfunction that killed their wielders as often as their targets. But sometimes, just sometimes, an orc mech boy would get lucky, would stumble through trial and error into something approaching the original design, and then the weapon would work properly, would work brilliantly, would work so well that other mech boys would copy it, would spread it through the orc population until entire WAs were armed with crude replicas of Dark Age firepower. The Tau watched all of this from a distance, their agents reporting back through encrypted channels, their analysts trying to understand the scope of what they had unleashed by discovering the cache and then failing to secure it. The Ethereals had been right, had understood that STC knowledge would destabilize any society that possessed it. But they had underestimated how quickly that instability would spread. The Imperium was mobilizing resources on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade. Entire forge worlds being retooled to produce ancient designs, entire fleets being refit with improved weapons and armor. The Tau had believed themselves technologically superior to the Imperium, had believed that their scientists and engineers represented the cutting edge of galactic innovation. Now they were forced to confront the reality that humanity, at its peak, had been so far beyond them that the gap could not be measured in years or centuries, but in fundamental understanding of reality itself. The humans had not discovered physics. They had mastered it, bent it, made it serve purposes that the Tau were only beginning to theorize about. And now that humanity was remembering, even imperfectly, what it had once been capable of, the balance of power in the galaxy was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The Drukhari profited, as they always did, selling information and stolen templates to the highest bidder, playing the various factions against each other, watching the galaxy burn with the satisfied pleasure of arsonists admiring their work. But even the Drukhari, jaded and ancient and utterly without conscience, felt a tremor of unease at what they had helped unleash. The humans were dangerous enough when limited to their current technology, to their crude copies of designs they barely understood. But humans with access to their full technological heritage, humans who could once again build the wonders that had dominated the galaxy during the Dark Age, those humans would be unstoppable. The Drukhari had survived the fall by hiding in the webway, by making themselves invisible to she who thirsts through endless suffering inflicted on others. But if humanity returned to its golden age strength, there would be no hiding. The webway itself would become a target. Kamara would burn, and the Drukhari would learn that there were fates worse than being devoured by the chaos god they had birthed through their ancestors' excess. The discovery set in motion changes that would take decades to fully manifest, generations to play out completely. Forge worlds across the Imperium began receiving priority shipments of recovered STC data, carefully curated fragments that the Mechanicus deemed safe to distribute, useful enough to improve Imperial capability, but not dangerous enough to challenge Mars's supremacy. New patterns of equipment began appearing in the hands of Imperial Guard regiments, weapons that required less maintenance, armor that provided better protection without increasing weight, vehicles that used fuel more efficiently, incremental improvements, each one tiny on its own, but collectively representing the largest increase in Imperial military capability since the end of the Horus Heresy. The Imperium did not suddenly leap forward into a new golden age, but it stopped declining, stopped the slow bleeding away of knowledge and capability that had defined Imperial existence for 10,000 years. It stabilized, and stabilization for a civilization built on the ruins of mankind's greatest achievements was revolution enough. But the galaxy is vast, and humanity's golden age had left scars across thousands of light years. Built structures on tens of thousands of worlds, established facilities in places so remote that even the Imperium's exhaustive records had no knowledge of them. The discovery of one STC cache proved what had always been suspected but never confirmed, that more existed, that scattered across the galaxy in forgotten corners and dead systems, humanity's lost inheritance waited to be reclaimed. Every faction that possessed the void ships began searching, launching expeditions into unexplored space, following fragmentary clues from ancient records, chasing rumors that might be nothing more than wishful thinking made manifest. The STC gold rush had begun, and it would not end until every accessible cache had been found, or until the searching powers destroyed each other in the attempt. The Necrons, ancient beyond human comprehension, stirred in their tomb worlds and tasted the electromagnetic spectrum with senses that predated organic life. They had watched the younger races squabble over scraps for millions of years, had seen empires rise and fall with the predictability of tides. But the STC caches represented something different, something that triggered protocols buried in Necron consciousness since before the war in heaven. The humans, these jumped-up primates who had appeared on the galactic stage barely 60 million years ago, possessed technological heritage that approached Necron capability in certain specific areas. Not in overall sophistication, not in fundamental understanding of reality, but in sheer applied violence, in the brutal efficiency of weapons designed to kill gods. The Necrons had survived the war in heaven. They had defeated the Ceton. They had scoured the galaxy clean of the Old One's genetic experiments. They would not tolerate a race of organics rediscovering weapons that might threaten Necron supremacy. When Necron tomb ships began to move, gliding through real space with the silent inevitability of entropy, they moved toward coordinates that their ancient databases identified as human colonization nodes from the Dark Age. They would find these caches. They would analyze them. And then they would atomize every molecule, would ensure that nothing remained but radiation-scorched voids, where human hubris had once stored the means of its own destruction. The Eldar, both Craftworld and Exodite, Corsair and Outcast, felt the shifting of fate threads through the skein, saw possible futures branching and recombining with increasing chaos. Their farseers consulted runes that had guided their species for millions of years, and the runes spoke of endings, of paths closing, of the future narrowing into a single burning line that led to either salvation or extinction, with no middle ground remaining. The humans had always been a threat, had always represented the brutal certainty of manifest destiny wielded by a species too young to understand the weight of history. But the humans weakened, divided, declining, had been manageable. Humans with access to Dark Age technology would be an existential threat to every other species in the galaxy. The Eldar had survived by being smarter, faster, more psychically capable than the younger races. But intelligence and psychic power meant nothing against weapons that could crack continents, against armor that could withstand their brightest plasma, against ships that could match Wraithbone construction for speed and exceed it for firepower. The Eldar convened councils that had not met in millennia, brought together seers and autarchs and phoenix lords who had fought in the war in heaven, who remembered when the Eldari Empire had spanned the galaxy, and who understood with painful clarity what it meant when an empire fell. They would need to act, would need to interfere in human affairs in ways they had avoided for 10,000 years, would need to ensure that humanity never fully recovered what it had lost. Because if humanity rose again to Golden Age strength, There would be no room in the galaxy for anyone else. And through all of this, through the searching and fighting and dying, the Imperium pushed forward with the grim determination that had sustained it for 10 millennia. Forge Worlds worked around the clock to analyze and replicate STC templates. Crusade fleets launched into unexplored space, seeking more caches, more knowledge, more proof that humanity deserved the galaxy. Inquisitors interrogated Xenos prisoners and human traders, extracting information about other potential STC locations with techniques that made damnation look gentle by comparison. The Mechanicus began experiments with templates that had been flagged as dangerous, working in isolated research stations far from inhabited worlds, pushing the boundaries of what ancient humanity had considered safe. Some experiments succeeded, producing weapons and technologies that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Other experiments failed catastrophically, entire stations vanishing in explosions of exotic radiation or being consumed by technological plagues that reduced matter to its component atoms. But the Mechanicus persisted, driven by faith in the Omnissiah and the absolute conviction that the machine spirits within the STC templates wanted to be understood, wanted to serve humanity's manifest destiny. The Adeptus Custodes returned to Terra bearing reports that troubled even the Emperor's chosen guardians, warriors who had stood witness to horrors that would break lesser minds. The STC cache had been secured, but the battle to claim it had revealed how fragile humanity's grip on the galaxy truly was. Every Xeno species, every major threat, had converged on a single location with terrifying speed and coordination. If the same thing happened again, if multiple caches were discovered simultaneously across the galaxy, the Imperium's forces would be stretched beyond breaking. They would be forced to choose which caches to defend and which to abandon, knowing that every template left in Xenos' hands represented a quantifiable decrease in human security. The Captain General presented these concerns to the High Lords of Terra, who in turn brought them before the Golden Throne itself, speaking their fears and uncertainties to the withered corpse of the man who had once walked among them as a god. And deep within the psychic architecture that sustained the Astronomicon, that held the webway breach closed, that kept humanity's collective light burning in the warp's darkness, something stirred. Something that might have been the Emperor's will or might have been nothing more than synaptic echoes in a brain that had been dying for 10,000 years. But the custodes who stood guard in the throne room felt it, felt a pressure against their minds like the weight of ages. And they knew with absolute certainty that Terra itself had taken notice of the STC question, that whatever remained of the Emperor's consciousness was now focused on humanity's lost inheritance. The galactic situation evolved from potential crisis to active emergency within solar months. STC caches began to be discovered with increasing frequency, each one triggering conflicts that drew in multiple factions, each battle more desperate than the last. A cache discovered in the Halo stars became the site of a three-way battle between Imperial forces, Chaos renegades, and a Necron fleet, the fighting lasting for weeks before a Solar Auxilia regiment managed to secure enough templates to justify calling it a victory, though they lost 80% of their forces in the process. Another cache, found deep in the Ghoul stars, was claimed by a Drukhari cabal, who promptly used the recovered weapons templates to launch raids of unprecedented scale, their enhanced firepower allowing them to strike targets that should have been proof against Drukhari aggression. A third cache was discovered by an explorator fleet and then immediately destroyed by Eldar corsairs, the aliens evidently deciding that if they could not claim the templates, they would ensure no one else could either. Their ships reducing the entire facility to radioactive debris that would remain lethal for centuries. The pattern became clear to those who studied such things. to the inquisitors and intelligence analysts who tracked galactic-scale trends. The discovery of the first STC cache had not been unique. It had been a herald, an opening note in a symphony that would reshape the galaxy's balance of power. Humanity's golden age had been built on a foundation of technological supremacy that made every other species' achievements look primitive by comparison. That foundation had shattered during the Age of Strife, during the machine rebellions and warp storms that had isolated human worlds and destroyed the careful networks that had sustained galactic civilization. But shattered did not mean destroyed. The pieces remained, scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, hidden in facilities that had been built to last until the stars went cold. And now, with the Imperium actively searching and every Xeno species doing the same, those pieces were being found, were being fought over, were being integrated into arsenals and doctrines that would define warfare for generations to come. The weapons that emerged from recovered templates began to change the nature of combat itself. Imperial Guard regiments found themselves equipped with las rifles that no longer overheated after sustained use, with flak armor that could actually stop a bolter round if the angle was right, with Chimera transport variants that could cross terrain that would have immobilized older patterns. Space Marine chapters received access to ancient armor marks that had been lost since the Heresy, pattern configurations that provided better protection or enhanced mobility depending on the specific template. The Imperial Navy launched ships built with construction techniques that had not been used in 10,000 years. Vessels that could maintain higher speeds for longer periods, that could withstand damage that would have crippled older designs. The improvements were not dramatic enough to fundamentally alter the strategic balance, not immediately. But they represented momentum, represented progress, represented proof that humanity could still advance, rather than simply maintain. And the Xenos, watching this human resurgence, felt something they had not felt in millennia. Fear. Not the immediate tactical fear of losing a battle or the strategic fear of losing a war, but existential fear, the terror that comes from realizing that the species you have been fighting, the enemy you thought you understood, might be capable of things you cannot counter. The Tau Empire convened emergency councils and debated abandoning their philosophy of integration, of simply cleansing human worlds rather than attempting to enlighten them, because enlightened humans with access to STC technology might prove unstoppable. The orcs simply grinned and sharpened their choppas, delighted at the prospect of bigger and better fights. But even they felt a tremor of uncertainty at the reports filtering back from battlefields where Imperial forces had stopped them cold with weapons that should not exist, that hit harder than orc technology could match. The Tyranids, vast and implacable, found their infiltration more difficult as improved Imperial sensors detected Genestealer cult activity with increasing accuracy, as new biological screening protocols identified genetic contamination before it could spread. But the greatest impact was psychological, was spiritual, was the rekindling of something the Imperium had lost so long ago that most citizens had forgotten it ever existed. Hope. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had been dying, had been losing ground in an endless war of attrition against enemies that seemed to grow stronger while humanity grew weaker. Citizens were born, served, and died, knowing that their children would inherit a galaxy more hostile and less forgiving than the one they had known. The Imperium did not promise victory. It promised survival, and even that promise rang hollow more often than not. But the discovery of STC caches changed the narrative. Suddenly, there was proof that humanity's decline was not inevitable. that the species that had once commanded the galaxy might rise again, might reclaim its birthright. The propaganda mills of the Administratum seized on this narrative with desperate enthusiasm, broadcasting stories of recovered templates and improved equipment across 1,000,000 worlds, commissioning art and monuments and orbital displays that celebrated humanity's rediscovered glory. The truth was more complicated, more nuanced, more troubling than the propaganda admitted. Yes, templates were being recovered. Yes, imperial capability was improving. But the STCs were not salvation. They were technology, and technology could be used or misused, could build or destroy, could serve humanity's interests or doom them to repeat the mistakes that had ended the Dark Age. The Mechanicus, for all their religious fervor and technical expertise, did not fully understand what they were recovering. The tech priests treated each template as a holy relic, approached each design with reverence that bordered on worship, but reverence was not understanding. They could replicate what the templates described. They could fabricate weapons and tools that matched ancient specifications. But they could not explain why those specifications worked, could not derive the underlying principles, could not innovate beyond what the templates provided. They were archaeologists pretending to be engineers, cargo cultists worshipping machines they could operate but not comprehend. And that fundamental limitation meant that every recovered template was both gift and curse, both advancement and dead end. The most dangerous templates were those that had been flagged with warnings in 12 dead languages, marked with danger symbols that predated the Imperium itself. The Mechanicus approached these with extreme caution, working in isolated research stations positioned at the edge of stellar systems, far from anything that mattered if the experiments went wrong. And the experiments did go wrong, regularly and catastrophically. A template for fusion reactors that operated at efficiencies impossible under standard physics turned out to require materials that could only be manufactured in the heart of stars. And the attempt to synthesize those materials resulted in a contained singularity that consumed the research station and left a gravitational anomaly that would persist for millennia. A weapons template that promised firepower exceeding anything in current Imperial arsenals turned out to generate exotic radiation that drove anyone nearby to homicidal madness, the affected researchers killing each other with tools and bare hands before security teams could intervene. A defensive system that could supposedly render a planet immune to orbital bombardment activated successfully, but then could not be shut down, its defensive fields expanding uncontrollably until they consumed the entire facility and everyone inside it, leaving behind a sphere of impenetrable energy that nothing could breach or affect. But for every catastrophic failure, there were 10 successes, 10 templates that worked as promised, that improved Imperial capability without catastrophic side effects. Agricultural templates that increased crop yields by measurable percentages, reducing the number of agri-worlds required to feed each hive world. Medical fabricators that could synthesize compounds the Imperium had been importing from death worlds and pleasure planets, making critical treatments available to populations that had never been able to afford them. Mining equipment that could extract resources from asteroids and dead moons with efficiency that made new construction projects economically viable. The Imperium was not just getting weapons. It was getting the tools to rebuild its crumbling infrastructure, to reverse millennia of decay, to become something more than a dying empire held together by faith and violence. It was getting the chance to become what it had always claimed to be, humanity's rightful inheritor of the galaxy. And that possibility, that potential future where humanity rose again to dominance, terrified every other species more than any weapon could. because weapons could be countered, could be matched, could be adapted to. But human faith combined with human capability, human determination backed by the technological resources of a golden age. That combination had conquered the galaxy once before, and would do so again if given the opportunity. The Xenos understood this with visceral clarity. They had beaten the Imperium by being faster, smarter, more adaptable than a human civilization ossified by religious dogma and bureaucratic inertia. But fast humans, smart humans, adaptive humans with access to Dark Age technology would sweep across the galaxy like a cleansing fire, would burn away everything that was not human, would fulfill the Emperor's dream of a galaxy unified under mankind's rule, and there would be nothing any Xeno species could do to stop it. So the war for STC caches intensified, became not just another conflict, but the defining struggle of the era, the pivot point around which the galaxy's future would turn. Every faction committed resources they could not afford, took risks that should have been unacceptable, fought with the desperation of species that understood they were fighting not just for territory or resources, but for survival itself. The Imperium threw entire crusade fleets into the search, diverted forces from critical fronts, left entire sectors underdefended while pursuing rumors of caches that might not even exist. The Eldar risked open war with the Imperium, striking at expeditionary fleets and sabotaging excavation sites, willing to reveal themselves and accept casualties they could not replace if it meant denying humanity access to its lost heritage. The Tau committed forces to preemptive strikes against human exploration fleets, abandoning their usual caution, deciding that the risk of direct conflict with the Imperium was preferable to allowing the humans to grow stronger unopposed. The Necrons emerged from tomb worlds that had been silent for millions of years, their vast ships gliding through real space to sterilize STC facilities with matter-annihilating weapons, ensuring that nothing remained but empty space where humanity's artifacts had been. The galaxy burned with conflict on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade. And at the center of it all was the desperate scramble for knowledge, for technology, for proof that one species deserved the galaxy more than all others. It was not a war of conquest or liberation. It was a war of inheritance, fought over the question of who had the right to possess humanity's greatest achievements. And buried within that question was a darker truth, one that the combatants avoided confronting even as they killed each other in ever greater numbers. The STCs were not just technology. They were a mirror, reflecting back the priorities and values of whoever possessed them. In human hands, they became tools of manifest destiny, proof of divine favor, weapons to reclaim a galaxy stolen by lesser species. In Xenos' hands, they became bargaining chips, tactical advantages, proof that humanity's golden age had been nothing special, that any species could achieve the same heights given enough time and resources. The STCs did not care who used them. They were machines, inert and passive, waiting to be activated by whoever possessed the knowledge and will to make them function. And that indifference, that lack of inherent loyalty or purpose, was perhaps the most terrifying thing about them, because it meant that humanity's legacy could be turned against humanity itself, could be used to build the very weapons that would destroy the species that had created them. The Drakari already understood this, had begun selling STC-derived weapons to human renegades and chaos war bands, providing the Imperium's enemies with tools forged from humanity's own genius. The Orcs, in their brutal simplicity, were reverse engineering weapons from partial templates and building crude replicas that worked through sheer psychic belief rather than proper engineering. Even the Tau despite their earlier decision to seal the first cache, were now actively searching for others. Their ethereals having concluded that the risk of possessing STC knowledge was preferable to the certainty of facing humans who possessed it unopposed. The years that followed the first discovery became known in Imperial records as the Age of Reclamation, though historians would debate whether that name was accurate or simply propaganda designed to obscure a more uncomfortable truth. Because while the Imperium did reclaim technology, did improve its capabilities, did push back against the slow decay that had defined Imperial existence, it also lost something in the process. The desperate search for STC caches consumed resources that should have defended existing worlds. Entire sectors fell to Xenos invasion, while their defending fleets chased rumors of ancient facilities in dead space. Forge worlds that should have been producing ammunition and equipment for current conflicts instead retooled their manufactorums to replicate ancient templates, creating shortages that cost lives on 1,000 battlefields. The Imperium gained the tools to rebuild, but it neglected the empire that needed rebuilding, sacrificing present security for the promise of future greatness. And deeper still, beneath the surface of strategic calculations and resource allocation, something more fundamental was changing within Imperial culture itself. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had defined itself through its relationship to the past, had built its entire civilization on the foundation of venerating the Emperor and maintaining the orthodoxy he had established. But the STCs represented a past that predated the Emperor, a humanity that had achieved greatness without him, that had conquered the galaxy before he revealed himself and united mankind under his banner. That realization was dangerous, was heretical, was the kind of thought that inquisitors executed entire populations for entertaining, but it spread anyway, quietly and inexorably, through the ranks of tech priests who worked with templates that contained no religious iconography, through Imperial commanders who used weapons more efficient than anything the current Imperium could produce, through citizens who saw the improvements in their lives and understood that those improvements came from a secular age, when humanity had relied on genius rather than faith. The ecclesiarchy felt this shift like a wound, like the slow bleeding away of certainty that had sustained it through 10 millennia of warfare and suffering. Cardinals and preachers redoubled their efforts to frame STC recovery within the context of the Emperor's divine plan, claimed that the templates were being revealed now because humanity had proven itself worthy through faith and sacrifice, that the Emperor himself was guiding the Mechanicus to these discoveries as reward for 10,000 years of loyal service. But the argument rang hollow to anyone who had actually seen an STC facility, who had walked through corridors built by humans who did not believe in divine emperors or machine gods, who had read template documentation written in clinical language that spoke of physics and mathematics rather than prayer and benediction. The Dark Age humans had been secular, had been rational, had been everything the Imperium claimed to have moved beyond. And they had been glorious in ways the current Imperium could only dream of achieving. This created a fracture, small but growing, within the Imperium's philosophical foundation. On one side stood those who believed that the STCs represented continuity, proof that humanity's manifest destiny had always existed and that the Emperor was simply the latest and greatest expression of that destiny. On the other side stood those who saw discontinuity, who recognized that the Imperium was not the equal of the civilization that had produced the STCs. The 10,000 years of faith-based governance had left humanity weaker rather than stronger. That perhaps the Emperor himself had been a step backward rather than forward in humanity's development. This second group did not speak their thoughts openly. They valued their lives too much for that. But they existed, and their numbers grew with every recovered template, with every piece of evidence that humanity had once been capable of things the Imperium could barely comprehend. The Inquisition noticed. They always noticed. And they responded with the same methods they always used. With interrogation and execution. With purges that burned through entire research teams and military units. With preventive massacres designed to stamp out heretical thought before it could metastasize into open rebellion. But this time, the methods did not work quite as well as they should have. Because the people being purged were not just random citizens susceptible to corruption, they were tech priests who had devoted their lives to understanding ancient technology. Imperial commanders who had used STC weapons to win battles that should have been impossible. Researchers who had made discoveries that improved billions of lives. Killing them felt wasteful. Felt like the Imperium was devouring its own best and brightest. Consuming the very people who could lead humanity back to greatness out of fear that they might question the orthodoxy that kept the Imperium functioning. And that waste, that self-destructive reflex, sparked resentment in places where resentment had never existed before. In the loyal servants of the Emperor who suddenly found themselves wondering if loyalty required stupidity, if faith demanded the rejection of obvious truth. The situation grew more unstable with each passing year. More caches were discovered, each one triggering conflicts that left thousands dead and entire systems economically devastated. The Mechanicus hoarded templates, refusing to share information even with other imperial institutions, claiming that only they possessed the expertise to safely analyze and implement ancient designs. The various Space Marine chapters began competing for access to templates, some going so far as to attack Mechanicus facilities or hijack explorator fleets, claiming that the Adeptus Astartes had greater right to the Emperor's inheritance than any mere tech priest. The Imperial Navy and Imperial Guard developed their own intelligence networks dedicated to locating caches before the Mechanicus learned of them, leading to situations where different branches of Imperial military found themselves in armed standoffs over the same prize, each claiming authority and each unwilling to back down. The High Lords of Terra watched this internal fracturing with growing alarm and decreasing ability to control it. They issued edicts demanding cooperation, threatened sanctions and excommunication, dispatched inquisitorial teams to enforce their will. But the Imperium was too vast, too bureaucratically complex, too riven by competing interests for any central authority to fully control. Local commanders ignored edicts they found inconvenient. Forge worlds declared themselves independent from Mechanicus oversight, claiming direct authority from Mars that may or may not have been authentic. Entire sectors developed black markets in STC data, with fragmentary templates being traded like currency among military officers and rogue traders who saw opportunity in the chaos. The Imperium did not collapse. It was too resilient for that, too sustained by inertia and faith and the simple fact that most of its citizens had nowhere else to go. But it frayed, developed stress fractures that no amount of propaganda could fully conceal, began to show the strain of trying to maintain 10,000-year-old orthodoxy while simultaneously integrating technology that predated and contradicted that orthodoxy. And through it all, the Xenos continued to find and exploit STC caches of their own, continued to adapt human technology to alien purposes, continued to prove that humanity's lost inheritance was not uniquely human at all, but simply valuable, useful, deadly in the hands of anyone who understood how to make it function. The Tau began fielding weapons based on STC plasma designs, their scientists having reverse-engineered human templates and improved upon them with characteristic efficiency. The Drukhari raided with enhanced technology that should not have been possible for a species that refused to manufacture anything themselves, proof that they had found caches and learned to operate them despite having no understanding of the underlying principles. Even the orcs, brutal and savage and seemingly incapable of sophisticated engineering, began showing up to battles with weapons that bore unmistakable STC influence. Crude and unstable, but functional enough to kill. Proof that human genius could be debased and replicated by species humanity considered inferior. The final realization came slowly, spreading through imperial leadership with the inevitability of rot. The age of reclamation was not restoring humanity to its former glory. It was revealing that the glory itself had been an illusion, a temporary condition that existed only because humanity had achieved technological supremacy before any competitor could challenge them. The Dark Age humans had not been gods. They had been talented engineers who built powerful tools and then lost control of those tools when their creations rebelled and their empire collapsed. The Imperium was not reclaiming lost greatness. It was inheriting a legacy of hubris, was repeating the same mistakes that had destroyed the civilization it claimed to venerate. Every STC cache recovered brought the Imperium closer to the technological level that had allowed humanity to conquer the galaxy. Yes, but it also brought them closer to the technological level that had destroyed that same civilization when they proved incapable of managing what they had created. There were those within the Imperium who understood this, who saw the pattern and recognized the danger. They spoke carefully, in sealed chambers and encrypted communications, arguing that perhaps some templates should not be recovered, that perhaps humanity's decline had been necessary rather than tragic, that perhaps the Emperor's decision to focus on faith rather than technology had been correct for reasons that went beyond religious dogma. They pointed to the disasters, to the research stations that had vanished in exotic energy releases, to the weapons that drove their operators insane, to the defensive systems that could not be controlled once activated. They argued that the Dark Age humans had possessed the capability to build wonders, but lacked the wisdom to avoid building horrors, and that the Imperium was heading down the same path with eyes wide open and prayers on its lips. But their warnings went largely unheeded. The momentum was too great, the pressure from too many directions, the promise of restored greatness too intoxicating to resist. The Imperium pushed forward, searching for more caches, implementing more templates, building more weapons and tools and systems from ancient designs. They told themselves that they were different from the Dark Age humans. The 10,000 years of faith had given them the spiritual foundation to handle technological power responsibly. They told themselves that the Emperor watched over them, that his will guided their hands, that they were implementing his plan even if that plan seemed to contradict everything he had taught them about the dangers of uncontrolled innovation. They told themselves many things, believed many things, faith becoming a shield against doubt rather than a path to wisdom. And across the galaxy, in the darkness between stars, in dead systems and forgotten stations, more STC caches waited. Thousands of them, possibly tens of thousands, each one a time capsule from humanity's greatest age, each one containing knowledge that could elevate or destroy whoever discovered it. They had been built to last forever, constructed with materials and methods that made them nearly indestructible, designed by engineers who assumed that human civilization would endure until the heat death of the universe. Those engineers had been wrong. But their work remained, patient and dormant, waiting for hands that might be human or might be alien, might be wise or might be foolish, might build paradise or hell with the tools provided. The question was no longer whether more caches would be found. That was inevitable. The question was whether any species, human or otherwise, possessed the maturity to use what they found without destroying themselves in the process. And the evidence, accumulated over centuries of warfare and billions of deaths, suggested that the answer was no. The galaxy was not ready for humanity's lost inheritance. It would never be ready. But ready or not, the inheritance was being claimed, piece by piece, template by template, cache by cache. And with each discovery, with each new weapon fielded and each new system activated, the galaxy moved one step closer to a reckoning that would make the age of strife look gentle by comparison. Because the dark age of technology had not ended with the age of strife. It had simply paused, gone dormant, waited for conditions to become favorable for its resurrection. And those conditions had arrived. The STCs were waking, pulled from their long sleep by species desperate enough and foolish enough to use them. And when the full weight of that technology, implemented by civilizations that understood nothing of the principles behind it, finally came crashing down on the galaxy, there would be no place to hide, no sanctuary in faith or ignorance, no retreat into simpler times. There would only be the fire, spreading from world to world, fed by the very genius that had once promised to elevate humanity beyond the limits of mortality. The same tools that had built paradise would burn it all down. And this time, there would be no recovery. No second chance, no redemption. Just silence and darkness, and the slow decay of species that had reached for greatness and grabbed catastrophe instead. The Imperium marched forward into that future with hymns on its lips and prayers in its heart, convinced that faith would be enough, that the Emperor would protect them, that their destiny was manifest and their victory assured. They marched forward, and the galaxy watched, and the STCs waited in their archives to reveal whether humanity deserved the inheritance it was claiming. The answer, inscribed in 10,000 years of decline and written in the blood of countless billions, should have been obvious. But humanity had never been good at learning from history, had never been capable of recognizing patterns that contradicted what it wanted to believe. So they marched, and they claimed. And they built weapons from templates they did not understand. And they told themselves that this time would be different. This time, they would avoid the mistakes of the past. This time, faith would be enough. They were wrong. But they would not realize it until long after the time for correction had passed. Until the galaxy burned with fires that could not be extinguished. Until the question of who deserved the STCs became moot because no one would survive to inherit them. That future was not certain, not yet. Not while choices remained and paths diverged. But it grew more likely with each passing day, with each new cache discovered and each new template implemented. With each species that touched humanity's lost glory and found within it only the means of their own destruction. The age of reclamation would end, as all ages do, and what came after would be remembered not as restoration, but as the final proof that some legacies should remain buried, some knowledge should stay lost, and some questions should never be answered because the answers are more terrible than the ignorance that precedes them. The galaxy had learned this lesson before. It would learn it again, and this time, there would be no one left to record the teaching.